Thank you, Harry, for that very, very kind introduction. I'm always slightly worried when I'm introduced as being the Impressionist specialist at Sotheby's, because I went not so long ago to talk to a nice group of ladies in Surrey, and I was announced as the Sotheby's specialist in Impressionists. And one nice lady put up her hand and said, "Did I know Rory Bremner?" So it's not that sort of impressionist. But what I am going to talk to you today about is exactly what you see up here, how art gets a value in the art market. And I am going to be telling you some appalling industry secrets that I've got to ask you all to forget when you go out of that door, because not everything that I say here will be, how can I put it? It's quite shocking, actually, but let's see. Anyway, okay, 10 questions that establish the value of a painting. 10 questions you have to answer. Is it authentic? Well, you would have thought that this was a pretty basic question. But the fascinating thing about the art market is that there are degrees of authenticity. Not everything is black and white. And indeed, there is absolutely no interest in something that's a total fake, obviously. But let's look at this, for instance. This was a picture from the school of Rembrandt, by a follower of Rembrandt. Definitely a 17th century picture, came up at Sotheby's 5 years ago, and we felt pretty sure it wasn't by Rembrandt. So we put it in at an estimate of £7,000 to £10,000. When it came up, there was a lot of interest in it, and it ended up making £120,000. Now, £120,000 is a non-price. It doesn't make any sense, because if it's just a copy, it's much too much. If it's a genuine Rembrandt, it's much too little. And the net result of all this was this in-between price, which was driven by this, how can I put it? It's a sort of fantasy, a speculative fantasy that gets people very excited about the possibilities of what something might be. And on top of that, of course, when you take Rembrandt as a case, you find that Rembrandt is one of those artists who is so disputed at the edges that you can buy a perfectly authenticated Rembrandt 1 year for a perfectly full Rembrandt price, and then 10 years later, the newly accredited bunch of Rembrandt experts could downgrade your picture, and you find you've overpaid, which is a bit of a disappointing experience. So this is how authenticity and fantasy about authenticity gets reflected in price. I must just tell you, on the theme of authenticity, how an experience that I had in the old days, many, many years ago, when I used to do the Antiques Roadshow. I was, I think, filming in Newcastle, and there were huge numbers of people who turned up on the day with their treasures in their plastic bags. And so many people came that it was necessary for the police to be there. The police were sort of marshalling the crowds. One of the policemen was standing directly behind the table at which I was sitting, trying to dispense wisdom. And the policeman was much more interested. He was obviously some sort of art buff. He was much more interested in what I was saying than in doing the job he was meant to be doing, marshalling the crowds. And I was having some difficulty explaining to this very nice lady owner that her Norwich School landscape, with a rather impressive looking signature on it, was not what it purported to be. And she wasn't really believing me. But at this point, I got help from the most unlikely source. The policeman himself strode forward and said, "But I, madam, on the other hand, am a genuine constable." Okay, is the artist fashionable? Artists go in and out of fashion, and indeed broader areas of art history go in and out of fashion. When I first started many years ago, all the highest prices that were realized at Sotheby's and Christie's were for old masters. Now the whole thing has changed about, and all the highest prices are for contemporary art. And that means that as that sort of broader taste changes, there are huge changes in prices. Just to take two examples. 15 years ago, the highest price for Francis Bacon was £8 million. And then it now stands at 143 million. Hockney, 3 years ago, the highest price was £18 million. Earlier this year, or no, late last year, one sold for $80 million. So I think this is fashion speaking, and that is yet one more factor that has to be computed in. I want to tell you about Tracey Emin. It's sheer chance that I happen to be mentioning her in the context of artists going in and out of fashion. I'm sure she will endure. Here she is. I was once in Sotheby's of an afternoon when word came through that a very eminent person had turned up and needed to be shown around the sale room. It was an elderly minor member of the royal family, a lady. And as for some reason everyone else was out, I had to take her around. And I thought, what shall I show an elderly lady member of the royal family that's on view at Sotheby's? And I thought, I'll show her a Stubbs. Can't go wrong with Stubbs, she'll love that. Unfortunately, on the way to the Stubbs, there was a great big neon thing in a contemporary sale that was coming up. And she said, what's that over there? I said, oh, Your Royal Highness, you really don't want to look at that. Come and see the Stubbs. She said, no, I want to have a look at that. And we came up to it. And she said, I haven't brought my spectacles. Tell me, what does it say? I had to say, Your Royal Highness, it says, kiss me, cover my body in love. And she looked at me and she said, very erotic. Anyway, that's not a meeting of minds. Let's move on. How important is the artist in art history? Well, obviously, some artists are unchangingly eternal. There is the pantheon of greatness, the artists who will never change in their desirability to the market. Obviously, Leonardo, Rubens, Titian, Michelangelo, Picasso, Matisse, they won't change. But there are changes in appreciation. This is a bit of an extension from individuals through to schools. It's been interesting over the past 20 years, probably, what a reappraisal there has been of, for instance, surrealist art in terms of the market, also of German expressionism, which has become more and more expensive. And one particular way that this manifests itself is here. I'm thinking of the exhibition of Miro the wonderful exhibition that was in Tate Modern about 6 or 7 years ago. And it so happened that just in the height of that exhibition, we had a sale in which we were able to include this magnificent 1930s mirror. And our estimate on it was 10 to 15 million pounds. It ended up making 28 million pounds, and I'm absolutely sure that that was because interest had spiked in the artist because of the exhibition at the Tate at the same time. So that sort of timing is also very, very important in establishing the value of a painting. We're going to come back to this picture in a minute because it's got other interesting aspects to it. Okay, now we're moving on to a category that I've invented, but which is very, very important. Does the artist have positive romantic baggage? The thing is, there's a backstory to how art gets created. A backstory which depends on the personality, the history, the drama of the life of the artist who created it. And I've listed here a few things that really do help to put the price up if they can be adduced to be germane to a painting by an artist. An unhappy love affair, if the object of that love affair is depicted in the picture, is very good news. It will definitely put the price up. And that leads on to muses. Artists have, throughout history, had particular muses, particular models who inspired them. And if that muse or model is depicted in a picture you're selling, it will put the price up. Madness. Now, this is a very, very subtle point. Madness is good news. If the artist can be shown to have been going through a bout of madness or being prone to madness, people feel that that is a sort of guarantee of his creative genius. Illness, completely different. One must never admit that an artist was ill when he painted something if one wants to sell it, because that implies some sort of diminution of his ability. So madness, not illness. Any sort of rebelliousness, I mean, if an artist could have been to jail, that helps. And if the picture could actually connect up to his time in jail. I mean, Egon Schiele had a famous brush with the authorities over a series of drawings that he made which were felt to be obscene. He was sent to jail for 14 days, and after the judge didn't exactly exonerate him, but set him free, and then, as a symbol, took one of his drawings of young, nubile, naked girls and set fire to it in the courtroom. This made such a deep impression on Schiele, but any drawing that dates from that sort of period in 1912 is very much prized by the market because it connects in with that piece of positive romantic baggage. And finally, of course, dying young. Very good news. Definitely a great career move, because apart from anything else, it limits the production. It means that, I mean, who died young? Theodore Géricault. His work is very, very sought after, quite rightly, because he was one of the great romantic geniuses of French painting, but also because it's quite limited. He was only 28 when he died. No, he was 32, sorry, but anyway. Schiele died when he was 28. This has the effect of limiting the output and making it rarer and rarer. These are a few muses. This is Modigliani's great muse, Jean Hébutin, and a portrait of Jean Hébutin is definitely worth more, all things being equal, than a portrait by Modigliani of an unknown woman. And here is the most famous piece of romantic baggage of all time, Van Gogh's ear. The whole backstory of Van Gogh is a huge enhancer to his value. I mean, obviously, he's enormously important as the inventor of Expressionism. But what gives his work that extra ingredient of desirability is his backstory, his madness, his never selling a picture during his life, and indeed, his tragic suicide. Now, 5 or 6 years ago, a new book came out on Van Gogh, a biography, which argued that possibly he had not taken his own life, but that he'd been shot by a passing peasant out rabbit shooting that day that he died, and he didn't die at his own hand. Now, this was an absolutely disastrous story for the art market. We absolutely had to suppress it immediately. Of course, I mean, it is true that there really was very little to justify this story, and it didn't actually take any hold, get any traction. But still, you see my point. He's worth more if he committed suicide than if he didn't. Okay, now, is the painting from a desirable phase in the artist's development? Now, all artists go through phases, go through stages in their careers, and some are more valuable early on, and some are more valuable in a middle period, and some are more valuable at the end. Okay, Picasso. All Picassos are extremely valuable in the market, but some are even more valuable than others. And something from this period, which is the early 1930s, when he was in love with Marie-Thérèse, and his passion spilled over into these glorious colours and huge, very, very passionate paintings. This is just about the most desirable phase in Picasso. And if this particular work came up today, who knows what it would be worth, but you know, it's 1932, it's Marie-Thérèse, probably worth 150 million plus. Let's look at another one by Picasso from 1969. I think you could say this is Picasso on an off day. I think this is Picasso with a hangover. I think it really is not a very good picture. So, you know, because it's from his late period, which is a period, although it's going up in value, is way, way down by comparison with other more important phases, this is probably not worth more than, whereas the previous one was 150 million, this is probably about 1.5 million. But it reminds me of something that happened to me with Picasso, with a particularly bad Picasso a few years ago. I used to help a very, very distinguished collector called Stanley Seeger to buy pictures at auction. He was one of the great Picasso collectors, and he really engaged with Picasso. I've never known anyone who read so much about Picasso, who struggled with what Picasso was doing. He had an understanding of Picasso that was absolutely second to none. So when he rang me up one day and said, please, could you buy in your sale, coming up tomorrow, lot 137 for me, that Picasso, I said, of course, Stanley. And I went off and bought it. And then I looked at it, and I saw it was even worse than this, which is saying something. But Picasso, as I say, had these off days. And I rang up Stanley, and I said, but Stanley, I got the picture for you, but honestly, why did you buy it? I mean, it really wasn't very good. And he said, I do agree. He said, it was terrible, wasn't it? It was so bad, I felt it had to be taken out of circulation. Which I thought is a very purist way of looking at art buying. Is it typical? Very, very important. Let's look at Monet. Here is a typical Monet, Giovanni, the artist's garden, the lily pond, the Japanese bridge, absolutely wonderful, just exactly what you want. And if you, as a rich, I don't know what, Chinese collector coming into the market for the first time with huge quantities of money, if you bought this picture and hung it on your wall, you could rely on the fact that everyone coming into your drawing room would say, you have a Monet, which is, of course, exactly what you want people to say. However, if you bought this by Monet, which is actually a rather nice little sketch of his daughter, there'd be absolutely no interest in it at all. No, that's an exaggeration, but the previous picture, which everyone wanted, would now be worth probably between 80 and $100 million. This picture, when it came up 3 years ago, fetched 340,000 because it's not typical. And typicality is so highly prized by the market. Okay, has the painting got wall power? Now, what is wall power? Well, I would define it as several different things. It's the mysterious factor that makes people want to own a picture. It's combined with various things, the composition, the colours, the emotional power, and that indefinable thing that is really impossible to isolate, but you know it when you see it, the sheer quality. And what always fascinates me is the difference in price that the market makes between something by an artist that is good and something by an artist that is supreme. And even though it's only a relatively small degree of difference, because it's absolutely at the top, there's a tenfold difference in price between the very good and the superlative. And I sometimes think about that and think, actually, that is the justification, that excuses the market. The market gets that right, and therefore the market is not totally flawed. Well, colour. Here is a Mondrian. Here is a very desirable Mondrian. I've done research on these Mondrians of this period, which consist essentially of grids of rectangular or square colour, divided up by black lines, and they're fairly simple, except the only thing that varies is the combination of colour. And if you analyse what prices this sort of Mondrian makes, you will find that the highest priced ones always have to have red in them. And this one does, obviously. That red factor is hugely enhancing of the price of a work of art, particularly by a major artist. Let's look at this Miro again. I think this is such a fascinating picture. I showed it to you earlier as an instance of a very high price that was achieved because the picture came up at the same time as a great Miro exhibition at the Tate. This picture, I think you will agree, depends for its success in a very large measure on that bit of red at the bottom. If you hold up your hand and get rid of the red, it's a much, much more innocuous picture. It's that red that really makes it. Another instance, I think, of how important red is aesthetically and commercially in this sort of painting. Okay, what's its subject? Okay, now here I'm talking only about traditional paintings. Contemporary art makes its own rules, but more traditional paintings do get valued because of their subjects in a very, very simplistic way. Landscapes, the more peaceful they are and the better weather they show, the more expensive they are. I'm making very, very broad generalizations here, but there is an inner truth to these. Portraits, well, we all know that a portrait by Reynolds, say, of a boring old man, even though it's extremely well painted, will always make a lot less than a portrait by Reynolds of an attractive young lady, even though it's not so well painted. That is another lesson. Still life. Well, look, let me show you a few examples because I think that's easier to understand. Here is landscape, and I tell you this story with huge shame. This is a picture that I handled very early on in my career at Christie's when I was doing a thing called the topographical sales. It meant that if you could identify where a landscape depicted, it almost automatically became worth more than just as an anonymous landscape. This landscape came along, and I eagerly looked at the back to see what title had been inscribed on it, and it said Mount Gogh. Mount Gogh. I thought, where is Mount Gogh? And I looked it up, and I found that there was a Mount Gogh in New Zealand, which made this a very, very interesting topographical picture of New Zealand interest. So I put it into the topographical sale as a view of Mount Gogh in New Zealand. Unfortunately, the day before the sale, it was pointed out to me what was written on the back was not Mount Gogh, but Mount number 9, and it was a framer's instruction. So it had to come out of that sale. Okay, this is on the point of portraits. This is quite a distinguished portrait by John Singer Sargent of an incredibly boring old man who must be someone's grandfather, so I'm sure he was delightful with his grandchildren, but anyway, he looks pretty dull. This came up not so long ago and fetched $30,000. This picture, also by Sargent, came up in the same year and fetched $2,200,000. Attractive young women make a lot more than boring old men, particularly, I feel, if they're horizontal, unless they're dead, in which case the whole thing has to start again. Anyway, this was a perfect example. We want happy pictures. The market wants happy pictures. And so this actually very beautiful Matisse failed to find a buyer because of that one tiny detail in the mouth where her mouth turns down rather than up. I mean, it's tragic, really. I mean, Matisse could have made it so much easier for us art dealers later if he'd only just put the mouth up in a grin rather than down in a scowl. So this picture failed to sell with a reserve of just over $1 million. And it was all because of the scowl. Here is a lady by Matisse, no bigger, this picture, than the previous one, but she's grinning. Thank you, Matisse. She's grinning, and this fetched 21 million. That's the value of a grin. Still life, what sells and what doesn't. It was a lesson one learned very, very early on when cataloguing old master pictures in the Christie's warehouse I did many, many years ago, that any animal that's dead is not good news. So, you know, lots of good things here, the fruit beautifully painted, but, oh dear, all that dead game. I remember cataloguing this as still life with fruit with sleeping birds. But no one was convinced, and sadly it didn't sell. Nudes. Now, nudes is a very, very interesting category because, of course, the great Western tradition of art is very much built on the depiction of nudes, and most of the great artists of the past painted nudes. This, obviously, is by Cézanne. The problem I'm approaching here is what to do with nudes when you're trying to sell them to, how can I put it, Middle Eastern museums who have religious reasons why they will not take nudes into their public galleries. They will not exhibit nudes in their public galleries. And the interesting thing with Cézanne is that these nudes are so unerotic, so much just an investigation of form that you can sell, honestly, a picture like this to a Middle Eastern museum. Whereas the next one, which is by Modigliani, and shows an unclothed lady who is definitely more approachable than those Cézanne nudes, you absolutely could not sell to a Middle Eastern museum. So that is a factor in determining value. When Middle Eastern buyers, and particularly Middle Eastern museums, are incredibly important in the market at the moment, at the very top. Fortunately, there are quite a lot of Russians who would buy something like this, so we needn't despair. Finally, just to show how no rules are totally without exceptions, when you get into the terrain of really great geniuses of the past. This is a magnificent painting by Rubens, but it does depict a scene of mass infanticide, which in most other people's hands would be a bit of a downer. But because it's Rubens, because it's magnificently painted, the subject matter is transcended here. And it was a picture that 20 years ago we put into a sale with an estimate of £4 to £6 million because we were a little bit worried about the subject matter, but we shouldn't have worried because it ended up making £46 million because it is a work of genius. And that is the transcendent factor when it comes to subject matter. Is it in good condition? Well, that's an obvious question, but pictures do, over time, suffer and need restoration. And if a picture has had too much restoration by a later hand, by a later restorer, then that, of course, diminishes its value. And 10, what is its provenance? Well, its previous history is surprisingly important in determining the price that a picture makes. If, for instance, a Cézanne can be shown to have been in the collection of the great American collector Paul Mellon, for instance, then it will get an extra desirability from that fact. If, on the other hand, it is shown to have been in the collection of the late Field Marshal Goering, it's not such good news, even though not everything that Goering handled was actually stolen, though quite a lot was. But it's not good news. But let me just lead on from that point into the whole question of the restitution of the art of the past, restitution of art that was stolen in the Second World War, and these are cases which only now are being looked into and settled with a number of interesting results for the market, not least the fact that very often these are pictures which in good faith went into museums between the end of the Second World War and between now, in modern times, when they have been discovered to have been looted during the war and therefore returned to the families of their original owners. Just to illustrate this a bit better, can I show you a specific case? This is a wonderful reed pen and ink drawing by Van Gogh. It belonged to a collector in where was he from? He was from North Germany. He was Jewish, and he put together the most wonderful collection in the 1920s. And then the Nazis came to power. He had effectively his collection confiscated from him, and it went up for sale in 1935 in Berlin. And this particular drawing was bought by the National Gallery in Berlin and went into their collection and became a very distinguished part of that collection. Fast forward to later in the war. Sadly, the collector himself died in Auschwitz, and no more happened in that case until 1990, when the Iron Curtain came down, and suddenly access was achievable to a whole lot of archives in East Berlin, in Eastern Germany. And from these archives, it was possible to discover that various sales that had taken place in the 1930s, which had apparently been legitimate sales, actually were forced sales. And this particular collector's collection in 1935 was proved not to have been a legal sale. Therefore, the owners, the legitimate owners, the rightful owners, were suddenly revealed to be the heirs of the original collector. But were there any heirs? A very, very brilliant lawyer in Berlin took the case on and discovered that the original collector had one son who, against all previous accounts, actually had escaped just at the end of 1939 and had gone to Britain. And there the trail went cold. But the German lawyer in 1990 was not to be dismayed by this. This is pre-internet days, obviously. He ordered up every single telephone directory from Britain and went through looking for the name of this original collector. And miraculously, he found the daughter-in-law, who was still alive, living very humbly in a little house in Leicester. And she was brought the extraordinary news that she now, as the sole heir, was the owner of this marvelous drawing, which had been now given up by the National Gallery in Berlin and was returned to her. And she took possession of it, she put it in the sale in Sotheby's. It was a very, very moving moment when it sold incredibly well for the best part of $10 million. And she actually went off on a cruise, which was rather nice. But my point really is that because of the history of this picture, its value and the story that was attached to it about its history, when it came up at auction, it made appreciably more than it would have without that story. So stories are important, particularly stories of earlier ownership. Finally, I want to show you one picture here, a very, very familiar image, a version of the Scream that we sold in Sotheby's about 6 years ago. It was an extremely exciting thing to be asked to sell because there are only 4 versions of this in the world and 3 of them are in museums. So this was the only one that would ever be buyable by anyone. And let's just look, let's put it through the test. Let's look at this picture and see how well it measures up on my 10 questions. Is it authentic? Yes, it was unquestionably authentic. It had a history going all the way back to Munch himself, and it even had an inscription and a poem by Munch written on the back of this board, because it is actually a pastel. It's a pastel on board, very rough board, which has got an incredible freshness. You see the colours are fantastically vivid. It's that roughness which caught the texture of the pastel and gives it this extraordinary vivacity. So yes, authentic, fine. Is the artist fashionable? Well, I would say definitely. Munch is one of the most fashionable and familiar artists in our present day world. And on top of that, this image is probably maybe just short of the Mona Lisa, but otherwise possibly the most recognizable picture in the world. So another plus. Was it important? How important is the artist to art history? Very, very important, because he's now recognized as, with Van Gogh, being one of the 2 sources of Expressionism, an incredibly important movement. Does the artist have positive romantic baggage? Yes, wonderful baggage he's got. He was on the edge of madness a lot of the time. He was a great purveyor of angst, which is a very, very marketable commodity in present day, in the present day market. Just for a moment, let me distinguish between angst and unhappiness. The sort of skull that we had on Matisse's face is different from angst. We want full Germanic angst, and then it's a plus, not petulant frowning from a French model. That's no good. And of course, on top of that, I mean, this was painted in 1891, which was the absolute peak, really, of Munch's creative life. On top of that, he managed to attempt suicide soon after this was painted. Sorry, just one more bit of romantic baggage. He succeeded in only firing the shot into his own fingers, which was painful but not fatal. But he was an artist driven by a lot of romantic backstory. Is the painting from a desirable phase in the artist's development? Absolutely, 1891. Is it typical? Absolutely. You couldn't get a more typical Munch image. Has the painting got wall power? Well, yes, indeed. A tremendous composition, tremendous colour, absolutely in your face. What's the subject? Well, a good bit of angst. Is it in good condition? Yes, it was in remarkable condition, with this very freshly preserved surface of pastel. wonderful, wonderful condition. And the provenance was good because it could be traced all the way back to the artist's studio. So having said all that, ticks all the boxes, passes every test, what happened when we put it up at auction? We just didn't know what it was going to make. It had huge potential, but the previous highest price for a work by Munch was $35 million. And we rather, and that had been for an oil painting, and this was a work on paper or on board in pastel, so theoretically a bit less desirable. But on, of course, this unforgettable image, we very nervously suggested it might make in excess of $60 million. Such was the storm of media interest in this picture when it came up in New York 6 years ago, that a book was opened on it at Ladbrokes. What was the Sotheby's Munch the Scream going to make? And to my amazement, I looked at the odds they were offering, and the shortest odds were at $120 million. A subsidy, I mean, how, that's very ambitious, I thought. When the hammer fell, it made $119 million, which I thought about a long time, and then I realized what this meant. It meant that somewhere in Ladbrokes was someone who knows far more about the art market than I do. Thank you very much for listening to me. Fakes are an absolute nightmare, and it is the single most important thing to avoid ever selling. So I think certainly in the major auction houses now, it is rare, very, very rare, for a fake to be offered, and even rarer for a fake to be bought. But it did happen about 3 years ago with some old masters, one of which sold for $6 million and was indisputably, in the end, shown to have been painted within the last 20 years through chemical and scientific analysis. I don't think I want to talk anymore about fakes. It's too upsetting. It does happen, but very, very rarely, thankfully. And when it happens and someone has bought a fake at Sotheby's or Christie's, that is the legal machinery for them then to cancel the sale and get repaid. So people are not ultimately saddled with out and out fakes. Well, I think that had it not been restored, it probably would have made $4 billion. I mean, it only made 450 million. I say that half jokingly, but the fact is that Leonardo has got such a magic that even one that's half restored is, people recognize that the chance of ever having the opportunity to buy another one probably won't come again in any of our lifetimes, because they're so rare that this huge amount of money was paid because of its rarity. But you're right, the element of restoration, which no one disputes was there in that picture, quite extensively, did diminish its desirability, but it diminished it only to 450 million. So I think, again, it's an example of what we saw to a smaller degree with the Rubens. Although the subject matter was dreadful, mass infanticide, because it was a great artist, it transcended. And the same is true of Salvator Mundi, that yes, there's a tremendous amount of restoration on it, but still the fact it is ultimately, originally by Leonardo, transcends those very real worries about condition. It doesn't help, I have to say. I think you're right. There were 8 versions, or anyway, multiple versions. And you're right, one is in Berlin. Yes, I mean, it's an interesting instance that Hitler was very clear that he loved that picture. And it doesn't do it any good. Or it wouldn't do it any good if it came up at auction. But I honestly don't think, well, certainly no version has ever come up at auction, certainly in my memory. And
yeah, well, I think I can't imagine that really affecting it, because I mean, if that would affect, then people would be saying, I can't listen to Wagner.
Yes, well, yes, and exactly, or Michael Jackson, even. No, I mean, it is a very interesting question. He had another favorite artist, Hitler, called Karl Spitzweg, who painted rather sort of sweet, romantic Bavarian scenes in the early 19th century. And Spitzwegs are reasonably sought after because they're very charming. Yeah. But I sometimes wonder whether the fact that it's only really a German taste, Spitzweg, has got something to do with the fact that he was one of Hitler's favorite artists. I don't know, but it's a very interesting question, that, absolutely. Well, I think that that is a demand now for contemporary figurative art. Almost, I'm going to say something terrible. I don't mean it too derogatorily, but almost as a relief from a certain amount of other contemporary art. There are, well, obviously, one looks at Francis Bacon, who, although now dead, is sort of has a contemporary influence. One looks at Freud, also dead, but also a great figurative painter, or Hockney, exactly, or a number of others who have come through in contemporary art. There's a Romanian called Adrian Ghenea, whose work literally 5 years ago was making 250,000 and is now up to 4 or 5 million. And he is very, very resolutely figurative. Now, there are a number of good figurative artists. Well, another is, of course, Sarah Lucas, whose extraordinary, impactful pictures of naked bodies do depend on an almost literalist depiction of real life. So yes, that it coexists with more unconventional ways of painting in contemporary art. I mean, I don't know how many artists in Heatherleys are actually painting figurative art. I would have thought quite a large number, I would imagine, because Heatherleys, as far as I can see, has a very rich tradition of figurative art. Or am I wrong about that? Oh well, hooray for Heatherleys, is all I can say. Yes. There is a lot of very brilliant marketing financial engineering done by a range of very brilliant contemporary art dealers. I don't think we've ever lived in a period, I don't think there has ever been a period in human history when contemporary art, the actual art of living painters, has been so highly appreciated. Not across the board, obviously, because there are still plenty of good starving artists, but just in terms of how contemporary art dominates the market, I don't think there's ever been a period in the past to match it. But within those parameters, there are definitely techniques whereby very clever marketers who are very, very brilliant art dealers do take on one artist and build them up, and they are not necessarily doing that totally by the criterion of the quality of that art. I suppose it's like all the arts, there is an element of luck, there is an element of being in the right place at the right time. But I would say that art dealers today have more power to create a very, very valuable, pricey commodity in the form of a particular artist than in almost any other of the arts. I mean, I don't think there is any publisher who could take an author and make him as popular and as expensive as art dealers can with artists in the present day. I mean, it is a fascinating time from that point of view. Well, I mean, I went through various categories of subject matter that are more or less saleable in the present market. But of course, what I was talking about there was very much older art, more traditional art. And it doesn't necessarily, what I was saying, doesn't necessarily apply to present day artists. I mean, I think it's an absolutely fascinating world we live in terms of this predominance of contemporary art, but I absolutely don't know where it's going. And I don't know, I wouldn't be able to offer anyone any advice about what they should be painting or in order to succeed. There is this huge element of luck, of being in the right place at the right time.